Hello, and welcome to another edition of Ask the Professor, where we respond to your questions about political philosophy, about culture, about history, about everything that's involved in trying to build a decent community and society together.
Here's a question we got via our YouTube channel saying, is there a book about Canadian history that's not dull? He says all those books that he's finding about Canadian history are, good historical accounts of what happened, but they're boring to read. And he's wondering if, in your opinion, there's anything about Canadian history that's good historically, but also, fun to read.
Oh, I'm sorry the question ended that way, because he was asking if there are books that weren't dull, and there are. There are books that are infuriating. Of course, there are also books that are both infuriating and dull. But Canadian historiography, there's a nice dull word just to start with, does have a terrible tendency to be boring, sanctimonious, plodding, tendentious, and ultimately unreadable. And this is something that I struggle with, because I love the kind of books that will get you into a subject, that are clear, that are brief, but that are not simplistic. I mean, a book like Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson, there really is not a better first book on economics. And I don't mean first book on economics for somebody who's 8, although it probably would work for an 8-year-old if they were interested, poor child. But for an adult, you go, if you've not looked at economics, you go from 0 to 60 in the space of just a couple of hundred brilliantly clear, witty pages. And speaking of children, I think, what is a book that a child should read on Canadian history? Well, I would actually recommend Tout's primer on British history, because we are part of the story that begins in Roman Britain. But when it comes to books on Canada, there's one that I really would recommend. It's a trilogy, actually. It's George Blackburn's books about being an artillery observer in the Second World War. It started with the Guns of Normandy. He said he'd written a trilogy. His publisher said, oh, come on, please, we'd be lucky to sell one. So they started with the middle one, the Guns of Normandy. And it was so enormously popular that you also got the intro volume, Where the Hell Are the Guns? And then the final volume, which is the Guns of Victory. And this is a wonderful account, one of the best accounts of World War II that I've ever encountered, and I think the best one ever by a Canadian. But that's just about one man's experiences in one particular fairly brief period in our history. Now, here's one reason that Canadian history books tend not to be riveting, that we don't have something like the Americans' industry of books about their Civil War. We have been blessed with a mostly peaceful history within our borders. The really great and terrifying adventures have happened outside Canada. And that's a good thing. Horatius at the bridge, it's wonderful. And, how can a man die better than facing fearful odds for the ashes of his fathers and the temples of his gods? But
there's something to be said for not dying, too.
You don't want that to happen. I was very struck by this when I was filming in France about the First World War, and thinking that I'll bet you the people who lived through it have been just as happy if history had gone in some other direction and not stomped on their fields and wiped out a generation of their young men. Yes, Canada, it's like Alexander Mackenzie. Alexander Mackenzie travels 68 billion kilometers or something like that up a river which he named Disappointment River, because instead of getting to the Pacific, he found himself in the Arctic Ocean. I wouldn't like to have been there when he expressed his feelings about that. It's an incredible accomplishment, but it doesn't lead anywhere, because the Arctic Ocean is not an important trade waterway. It's not a place people fight over, except in small-scale Stone Age skirmishes. And so Mackenzie went back and he studied more on navigation. He eventually made it to the Pacific Ocean and was chased off by hostile natives. I mean, it's kind of an amusing story. But in the same way that history under despotism really is just kind of one thing after another, it's anecdotes rather than a compelling story, the successful flourishing of liberty under law in Canada, as a result of all those things that happened in Britain, and the fact that Canadians stood resolutely with other members of the Anglosphere in the great crises of the 20th century, it makes for a good life. But it doesn't make for riveting reading. And then you get this tendency of Canadian history books to want to lecture you on how we've always been exponents of big government, which is not merely untrue, but also boring. That's why I quote that line from Prince Caspian in the Narnia Chronicles, that the history that was taught in Miraz's Narnia was duller than the dullest history book you ever read and less true than the wildest fiction. I think there's often an inauthenticity about this official, Laurentian elite narrative about us as embracing big government. In fact, Canada was founded on liberty. So there are good books. One that I really like is Fearful Symmetry, The Fall and Rise of Canada's Founding Values by Brian Lee Crowley, because Crowley's quite clear that this was a nation founded in liberty and we really need to get back to it if we don't want to have our success slip away. But the sad truth is, when it comes to really good one-volume Canadian history, there just isn't one. And there isn't one partly because the subject matter doesn't lend itself to the grand stage. Right? We have no Abraham Lincoln because we had no Civil War, because we had no terrible institution of slavery. We did have slavery, but it was suppressed quickly and effectively. And that's a real act of statesmanship, but it's just not as interesting as the Battle of Gettysburg. But also because I think people have written it from a point of view of trying to convince us that we are people who need to be protected by the state from our own inadequacies. And that would be boring even if well written, which it usually isn't. So there's a great story there. But really, if you want to know the Canadian story, read the British story and understand that we are the inheritors of that story. As I point out, Vimy Ridge was only 100 years after the Battle of Waterloo, well, 102 years. And the people who fought in the trenches of World War I saw themselves as in that tradition. And of course, you watch my documentary, The Great War Remembered, and you'll see how that war mattered to Canada. I think that will give you some sense. I know it's a bit self-promoting. And it's only, again, about one particular incident in our history. But that's the kind of thing that will give you a feel for who we are. That book still needs to be written, including a colorful depiction of Alexander Mackenzie tearing his beard and stomping his feet in an Arctic wasteland.
Gosh darn it.
So there's an opportunity there.
Ocean, yeah.
But you're still not going to turn our history into a history where, for the English Civil War, a terrific fight over liberty with some right and some wrong on both sides that killed more per capita than the First World War did. We never had that. And thank goodness we didn't, even if it does make for somewhat dull history. We could do better than we can, but you cannot turn this into a huge conflagration because we were blessed not to have one.
Yeah, like Isaac Brock. That's a good story. I mean, that was kind of dramatic. There are some good dramatic stories, right? The explorers who went down and discovered the Mississippi and all that. That's our story, too.
It is our story, but of course it's not our river. We got Disappointment River, which was then renamed the Mackenzie River. So there was a small measure of vindication, but it still drains into the Arctic Ocean. You can't change that.
Okay, let me ask a follow-up question. I'm sure some of our viewers are wondering about, would you be up to writing that book?
Thinking about it, yes. It needs to be written, but, of course, what I'll end up doing is writing the history of Britain, and then we're doing this documentary, of course, on fixing Canada's constitution, and a great deal of the historical background, the evolution of our parliamentary institutions, is the story of Britain. Because we inherited a constitution similar in principle to that of the United Kingdom in 1867, where a great deal of the heavy lifting had already been done by men who are, I think, genuine Canadian heroes. I want a statue of Edward Cook on Parliament Hill. I want a statue of Stephen Langton. The fact that they didn't live on the landmass of Canada doesn't mean that they are not Canadian heroes. And one thing is we must stop being parochial, because you cannot write interesting parochial history. We must understand that this is a grand story of which we are a part. We are in one of the safer parts of it, but we have been called upon to go out into the world and will be again. We must tend this heritage. There is much passion and excitement here. King Arthur is a Canadian figure. And if you want to know why, wait for the documentary, because it's in there.
Mm-hmm. Or maybe we need to find you a good editor who will keep you in the straight and narrow.
Where
on the straight
shall
and
we
narrow.
find such a thing?
I don't know. I'll have a look somewhere. All right. Thanks, folks. If you want to play along, the URL on your screen will take you to a page where everything is explained if you want to ask your question of the professor. Thank you, and see you next time.